I know that you came here to listen to me. Maybe not. I get the honor of introducing. Oh, sorry, I'm Teresa Morrison, that person up there. I get the honor of introducing Jimmy, and of course, we all know and love Jimmy. So, like, what do you say? Ultimately, Jimmy, when he's not spending time chauffeuring his kids around or speaking at conferences, he's actually writing to make humanity better. So, under his belt, he has multiple books, as I'm sure you guys know. But the breadth of the topics is quite astounding, actually, starting with programming Bitcoin, which some of you out there understand, to the little Bitcoin book, which some of us up here understand. And then he co authored some things that we all think. So we've got Thank God for Bitcoin, which was co authored. And I think Gabe Higgins is here. So that was Gabe and Robert Breedlove and a few others. Please, the others count importantly as well. And then with our very own Gary Leland, he co-authored, Bitcoin and the American Dream. And we've got some of the other authors sprinkled around and throughout the conference today. Really, what he's done is we're now moving into like his last opus. Well, not his last one, but the latest opus, right? And this is what we all know, right? Fiat ruins everything. So if you haven't read it, to give you a perspective from somebody else, somebody different, something different than your own, I encourage you to go out after Jimmy speaks and flip through the book and make sure you take a copy home. But today, what he's going to talk to us about is rent seeking. If you know what that is, good for you. If you don't know what it is, he's not looking for an apartment, and you will now find out. So I'm going to turn the time over to Mr. Jimmy Song, and a good round of applause for him, please.
All right, good to see all of you out here in Dallas. I always like Bitblockboom. It's sort of like a special one for me because it's in the home state of Texas, um, and it's not a far drive from my house and stuff like that. And one of the things I like to tell people about Texas is I moved here because of the liberty, right? Because of I used to live in Massachusetts, so it's pretty much a communist state. Here, it's a lot more free, and but things are changing, right? Like there's a lot more government controls and things like that happening all over the world, and countries that we used to think of as free are starting to become more tyrannical. And that's what I'm going to talk about. It's about destroying rent seeking because the rent seeking has been turned up to 11, and it's continuing to destroy civilization. Um, and what I want to talk about after that is about how Bitcoin is reviving civilization. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, as Teresa said, not everyone knows what rent seeking is, and if you haven't heard me rant about it, then you probably don't know. So here's what rent seeking is. It is getting in the middle of a transaction or preventing someone from doing what they want and collecting some sort of tax or fee on it. So here is sort of the prototypical example. You're riding on a boat and you're going past somewhere and some guy has a chain up and says, "You can't cross until you pay me." Now, this person that's doing that isn't adding any value, right? It's more like extortion. And as we'll see, almost all rent seeking involves some form of violence as a way to enforce the rent seeking. Right? You're getting in the middle, you're collecting money, and you're not adding any value. And that's the essence of rent seeking. And um, my thesis here is that everyone or a lot of people engage in rent seeking all over the place in the economy. So here are some examples of rent seeking. So taxes, right? Like they don't really add any value, right? In fact, they're subtracting value clearly. I think Rodolfo was complaining about the 8% sales tax here in Texas. That's a prime example. Like, what is the government adding when I'm buying a stick of gum from you? Nothing. But they collect, and that's one of the forms of rent seeking. Giving permission, right? Like if you want to do something, you need to get the approvals of certain people and you need to pay them fees and so on. That's another form of rent seeking. Gatekeeping. If you want to become a certain profession, then you're not allowed until you get this license from the state, something like that. Compliance requirements. You might be already running a business that's doing certain things, to benefit the economy or so on, but they need you to file certain reports. They need you to do certain things that really don't add any value, but that's what they're demanding as a way to sort of pay them. Now, we're going to look at rent seeking at three different levels in this talk. So, we're first going to look at rent seeking at the company level, and there's plenty of that. Then we're going to look at the government level and all the rent seeking that happens there. And then finally, we're going to look at the world level. These are sort of like increasing in scope, and the idea is to see how everything sort of fits together. So let's start at the company level and let's look at company rent seeking. So here's an example: insurance, right? At least in the United States, you are required to have car and health insurance. If you want to drive a car, in most states, you are also required to have liability insurance for that car. Now, who does that benefit, right? I mean, if you wanted to, if you made that voluntary and you bought it because you wanted to protect yourself, that's one thing. But if the state requires it, now suddenly the car insurance companies get to make a lot of money. Similar thing with health insurance. In the United States, you are required to buy health insurance as part of living here, which is a very strange sort of thing. In other countries, health is provided by the state, and you're forced to pay taxes on it. But who does that benefit? Well, it benefits the health insurance companies. There's a conglomerate of six of them or so that take a lot of the money that is involved in health. And if you want to sort of get an idea of how much money they're making, Andy Schoonover has a startup called Crowd Health, and the amount of money you pay there versus what you pay for the health insurance, the mandated health insurance, is significantly different, right? And it's all of the money leaking to these paper pushing bureaucrats that are collecting rent on your sort of fears about health. Now, some other ones, subsidies. Most of this is done through loans. So housing is a favored industry because mortgage rates are lower than almost any other kind of loan. So if you look at like your credit card, for example, you're probably getting like 18, 20, 22% right now. Housing is still 6, 7, 8%. That tells you that they're subsidized in some way. They essentially allow money printing for the purpose of housing. Similarly, student loans are subsidized, and they're lower than they would be in a normal market. Especially if you think about who's actually taking out these loans. If you're an 18-year-old with very little assets or skills, giving them a loan doesn't make much sense. And if you did, it would be at a very, very high interest rate. So the fact that you have student loans means that universities benefit significantly, as do real estate developers, real estate agents, lots of particular people. And finally, like media, and this is not so much in the United States, but in Canada and the UK, you have like the BBC, which is a state subsidized media company, and the CBC in Canada, which at this moment is pretty much the only media company that's allowed to exist. Everybody else is pretty much shut down. These are subsidized by the state, and it benefits those companies. There are also monopolies that are granted by the state in some ways. A lot of energy, a lot of utilities are essentially monopolies in a particular place, and of course they benefit those places. Oftentimes it's similar with internet, a lot of water utilities. I remember going to Lebanon about a little over a year ago, and one of the monopolies that they had granted was a mobile phone service. So there was no free market for it. You had to buy it from the state. And what I realized was almost everywhere else you can get like a week of internet on your phone for about $5. That's normal. But in Lebanon, it costs 40. Why? Because you have to fund all those rent seekers, and it's a country that's undergoing hyperinflation. So $40 is a lot. Um, Compliance. So one the many regulations that a government puts down usually means that there's a lot of personnel that's required to comply with certain things. So you have law, HR. If you want environmental something or other, you need to get an environmental scientist that's considered an expert by the state, which is licensed by the state. So there's multiple levels of rent seeking here, and there's a you know entire industries grow up around being able to collect money in between in these transactions that are really not that necessary. And of course, the biggest rent seekers of all, banks. You have investment banks, commercial banks, even venture capital. I consider a form of banking. They give you money, and instead of having debt, they get equity and so on. But these are of course exacerbated by the fact that they can print money into existence. So these are all the ways that companies rent seek. So what are the consequences of this? Well, first of all, a lot of value gets captured, right? If you have all of these entities that are sort of like sucking money away or sucking value away, well, a lot of that value isn't coming to the end customer. This is why you see sort of like a degradation of quality all over the place. It's not just inflation. Inflation definitely plays a part in it, but as you have more and more entities sort of like sucking 2-3% away from the value, well, soon you have to debase the product gets more and more debased. Profitability gets destroyed. One of the things I like to point out is how during the gold standard, the normal dividend for a company was like 10%. This is dividend, right? Dividend. So if you have a stock that's worth $100, you would get paid $10 a year just for owning the stock as part of the profit share. Now, nothing like that exists today. I looked up like the highest dividend yield that you can get from a stock, and it was something like 1.5%. And usually, even the very low 1.5% are financially distressed companies that are trying to attract capital. But profitability gets destroyed. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of the banks and all of the leverage that you're allowed to get. Um, you can play these financial games where, say you have a business that has a 30% profit margin. Well, what can happen, especially in a low interest rate environment? What happens is somebody else comes in and says, I'm going to borrow a ton of money, buy out your business, and put the loan on the balance sheet of the company. So what does that do? Well, it basically means there's an extra expense, but you get the company, right? And that extra expense is servicing that debt. So what was a 30% profit margin might now shrink to 10. But you're happy with 10 because 10% is probably still a decent amount of money, especially if you have a decent amount of revenue. So that happens, and then the next guy comes along and says, you know what, I'm going to do another leverage buyout and shrink that profit margin from 10 to 3% or whatever, right? Until it gets arbed away because of this ability of money to come into existence out of nothing. And as a result of that, you get a lot of financial games being played, because if your profit margin is like 3%, well, you don't have much room for error. And if any shock comes into the system, you're in a lot of trouble. So you need to get more into debt to figure out how to get out of the current pickle that you're in, and so on. So financial games end up getting played a lot. And that induces this deep dependence on debt, because pretty much everybody relies on debt to grow. And if you don't have access to debt, well, you are at a severe disadvantage to your competitors. And also, you're like, all the profit gets destroyed by debt. So more debt comes on the balance sheet, all the value gets captured by the people that issued the debt out of nothing, which are the banks. So what we end up with are fragile zombie companies, right? Like they're very fragile because any disruption will cause them to just go bankrupt. They don't have any room. The profit margins get shrunk to nothing. and they're essentially zombies living on borrowed debt, right? And that's a sad thing that kind of happens. And I'm reminded of United Airlines, and one of the things we found out during the pandemic was that they needed a loan during the pandemic. Obviously, no one was traveling, so they needed a loan. They went to the investment banks, and normally, what an investment bank does is, okay, we need collateral for it, and go, okay, yeah, we have all these planes, but they weren't sure that these planes would be worth as much, so they said, you know what? Instead of the planes, we want your miles program. I said, okay, yeah, sure, we'll do that. So, in order to get a loan against a miles program, they had to figure out how much the miles program was worth. And United got a loan from some investment banks to continue their operations, and they valued the United Miles program at $22 billion. Now, that wouldn't be anything notable, except that United's market cap at the time was 10 billion. So that's really weird, right? It's like finding out that your kitchen is worth $800,000 when your house is on the market for 400,000. Like, how does that make any sense? Well, it turns out that that does make sense because United is actually more like a bank that has an airline to discharge its debt. And the way that they act as a bank is by issuing their airline miles. They sell airline miles printed out of nothing to credit card companies and other affiliates as a way to fund operations whenever they come up short, and they discharge the debt. And what's even worse, they debase the miles every once in a while so that you have more restrictions on what you're allowed to fly and so on. This is the game that's being played. Really, they're a bank that's using flying people to discharge their debt than the other way around. So that's the kind of companies that we come up with, and it's no surprise. Like U.S. airlines, like United, have gone bankrupt like twice in the last 25 years, and they just kind of get revived again. Though the miles programs stay. All right, so let's talk about the government level, and here's some examples of their rent seeking. You have transaction taxes. This is bilateral transactions between two people, right? If I employ you, that would be payroll. If I'm selling you something, that would be sales. But there are taxes on those, even though obviously the government doesn't add very much there. You have property taxes. This is taxes for stuff that you own, real estate, cap gains, sometimes straight up confiscation. You have licensing of various institutions and professions that are not allowed to exist without the government's permission. You have regulations of all kinds of things, TSA, health, and all kinds of those things, which are required of you, despite like them really having no business, right? Like the TSA, like what do they do except just sort of like prevent you from getting on the plane on time and making you go to the airport like an hour and a half early? And essentially, you have this giant apparatus of things that don't really make that much sense, but they continue to exist because these are rent seekers. Um, Tariffs are another big one. One of the things I found out when I was in Brazil was that Apple products are significantly more expensive. And one of the guys there that I met at a Bitcoin conference there told me that it would be cheaper for him to fly to Miami and buy a MacBook and fly back than to buy the MacBook there. And the reason is because the government is rent seeking, right? They know Apple products are desirable, so they put a tariff on it as a way to raise revenue. Similar thing in a lot of other countries, and that's a sad fact. And of course, the biggest rent seeking of all is inflation, and this one is particularly great from the government's perspective because they have some level of plausible deniability. The consequences are that everything becomes political. There are all kinds of rent seeking opportunities all over the economy. And that means that if you want your rent seeking opportunity to not go away, you have to sort of play politics a little bit. Or if you want new rent seeking opportunities, you have to kind of lobby for it. So everything becomes political. It's a way in which you can get the things, the rent seeking jobs you want. And inflation becomes favored over other forms of taxes because inflation, like I said, has plausible deniability. If you are getting taxed on your real estate and they raise that from like 1% to 5%, you would complain pretty hard because obviously you have to pay the tax collector, and it's usually at the threat of violence. So you have to give it to them, and you know who the villain is. But with inflation, there's some plausible deniability. You can say, "Oh, those greedy corporations," or Beyonce. I don't know. There's a lot of different people that you can blame inflation on. So they have that plausible deniability about the theft that they're engaged in. And as a result, development stops. A lot of development that should, you know, technological progress and so on, just it becomes static because no one has really an incentive to change things. If you have a rent-seeking position or an apparatus built around a particular industry, you don't want to crumble any of it because your job depends on it. And this is why you essentially end up with a static society. Now, I want to show you these two pictures. The black and white photo is of London in about 1920. The color picture is of London. Anyone want to guess around what year that is? Yeah. So you guys guess pretty much. It's 1970, right? So that the difference between these two pictures is about 50 years. Um, But you look at the color picture and you change up the cars a little bit, it could be today, right? Like not much has changed that much. It's the development between 1920 and 1970 was significantly higher than 1970 to 2020. What that should tell you is, hey, like something happened, and we're slowing down on the rate of change, and things are sort of like not improving. All right. So the final thing that I want to focus on is the global rent seeking, and there's significant global rent seeking because of the dollar hegemony. There is a dollar hegemony because of sort of like a quirk of World War II. A lot of the gold ended up in the United States, and they were able to impose on the rest of the world a monetary world order where everyone had to use dollars. And after 1971, when Nixon cut ties to gold, that changed the petrodollar. And everyone needs dollars to buy petrol. And hence, it's become the most liquid currency in the world. Now, a large part of the global rent seeking happens through these like three-letter organizations, as we like to say: IMF, World Bank, Bank of International Settlements. They put out a lot of loans, especially to developing countries. And that sounds compassionate, but it's not. It ends up being very detrimental to them because the debt stays no matter what. So, one of the things that I found out from Alex Gladstein's book, Hidden Repression, I highly recommend you read it, is that if there's a revolution in some place, so we had, for example, the Arab Spring, right? Egypt had some debt to the IMF, and they changed governments. Now, what a new government would love to do is say, we repudiate all these debts because they were made by the previous, they were taken in by the previous regime. So it has nothing to do with us. These are not our debts. Any country that does that will get in some serious trouble. You will have sanctions and all kinds of stuff held against you. You have to keep the debt that a previous regime did. So when you know that, you're obviously incentivized to take out as much debt as possible and saddle everybody else with it in the future. And that causes development to just get crazy because no one's paying any of this back. And it ends up um, they end up with austerity measures, and usually what happens is they end up producing goods for the Western world, basically. And this is what we call the exorbitant privilege and monetary imperialism, because all of that money gets printed out of nothing. The money that gets loaned to these countries is really stolen, and then they get stolen again by the regime in power, usually. And the way you can think about it is that Belt and Road, the BRICS alliance stuff, all of that is trying to replicate the same model. What Belt and Road Initiative is doing is with African and Asian countries is the exact same thing that the IMF and the World Bank have been doing with the developing countries in the past 70 years or so. And this is a way to sort of like imperialize them without firing a shot, without having to use guns or occupy them. You just control them monetarily. So, what are the consequences of this? Well, you get a lot more military intervention. Sometimes they will say, you know what, we repudiate, we repudiate these debts and we're not going to pay any of it back. Well, then we have a problem now, don't we? Because if you let one country get away with it, all the other countries are going to say, well, we're not going to pay these back either, and you're not going to be able to control them, and so on. So you get a lot of military intervention. Why is look at the last four wars that the U.S. has been involved in? Right? Ukraine is nowhere near us. Right? Iraq is nowhere near us. Afghanistan is nowhere near us. Vietnam is nowhere near us. It's the dollar hegemony that needs to impart its control over all of these places. You also get cultural imperialism, and this I think was pretty evident during like the George Floyd stuff. It wasn't just in the United States. All of these protests were going on in a lot of other places around the world. And I was reading about how they were doing that in London, despite like there was another huge tragedy, but no one protested about that. It was all about George Floyd in the United States. So I tell you, like the U.S. sort of dominates conversation everywhere else, and everyone has to do basically what the U.S. says. And you get technology restrictions. One of the saddest things is how we haven't progressed at all on nuclear. And why haven't we? Because the last advance pretty much was in the 1950s when we made the nuclear submarine. And this is a double water reactor design that is essentially used in every nuclear power plant since then. We haven't explored it at all because this would give too much power to individuals or countries. So if you want to develop nuclear, you're going to become a pariah to the rest of the world. And this is one surefire way to get sanctions placed on you is by trying to develop them. And you get developing world poverty. There's a deep dependence, these austerity measures that inevitably come as a result of not paying back loans. And you get African countries that are producing palm oil, food that's not food. That's like something that is used by Western countries for their consumer products and so on, instead of actually developing these countries with buildings and roads and factories and energy and things like that. So at all of these levels, what we're seeing is rent seeking just absolutely destroying civilization itself. Right, we're seeing all kind less efficiency at company levels, just sort of like a static society as a result. You see more and more rent seeking. You see things going backwards. Things aren't improving. And of course, at the world level, you're starting to see some of that dollar hegemony starting to break as a result of all the weird stuff that they're doing with the dollar. And what that does to people is that it emphasizes political activism, and this is in stark contrast to entrepreneurialism. That's a natural thing to do, is to try to go add value to other people so you can earn money. Instead, people are politically active to get money thrown at them by the money printer. And it ends in a lot of self-serving beliefs. I deserve the money because of this, rather than trying to seek the truth, which a market-based system like incentivizes. If you're completely delusional about something in the market, you're going to get hurt in your wallet. But if you're completely delusional in the political realm, no one cares. It's or like you can sort of do it as long as the majority is with you. It's a might makes right kind of thing. And you outsource virtue instead of practicing virtue. In a market, you need to practice virtue. You need to be reliable as a trading partner, for example. Otherwise, no one wants to do business with you. But you outsource virtue. It's the same as sort of like pretend like getting someone else to do something is the same as you doing it yourself. You voting for something is the same as you having love and compassion for them. That's the effect that it has. It makes people very high time preference, and it, I think, ultimately gets them very depressed. So how does Bitcoin fix all of this? Well, first of all, we have Bitcoin holders, people like yourselves, right? You have a different set of values, and you have this ability to not get debased on your savings, right? It isn't constantly stolen from you. And with enough Bitcoin holders come Bitcoin communities. And we have a few, I mean, even your local meetup, I think, can be considered a Bitcoin community. But we have some very purposeful ones, like the one in El Salvador or in Peru or in South Africa. These are all communities that are working on a Bitcoin standard. And it changes the way you do things because there's no rent seeking in Bitcoin. It's very hard to get in the middle of a transaction because there's no permission required. And enough of those will bring Bitcoin countries. The closest thing we have right now is El Salvador. And I've been there 4 times in the last 2 years. And I can tell you that every time I go back, I'm astounded at how much things are improving, right? Like just versus the last time, the delta is enormous. There's new buildings, new roads, new cars, new everything, right? Like they're constantly building, cleaning up stuff. This is what you unleash when you get rid of a lot of the rent seeking of fiat money. And if enough Bitcoin countries come together, then we get on a Bitcoin standard. And I think this is really where we want to be because it's a lot more fair and it allows countries to develop naturally instead of this weird dependence on foreign currency as it is now. This is where you guys, well, this is where we say it's still early, right? Like you guys are all here. We're a part of this community, and we're all trying to make Bitcoin happen, and it is happening. Uh, but you guys are the vanguard, right? You guys are the first people to adopt Bitcoin, and that's how we're going to win, and that's how we're going to destroy rent seeking. Fiat delenda est. Thank you.